Ah, Kwame Nkrumah, the man, the myth, the legend. You know, it's not every day that a guy from a small village in Ghana manages to put not just his country, but the entire African continent on the global map. Yet, here's the twist. Some people call him a visionary. Others, well, they'd call him a walking disaster. So, who exactly was Nkrumah? And why is his name still sparking debates decades after his death? Buckle up, folks, because today we're diving into the fascinating roller coaster life of Ghana's first president. And no, I'm not just going to give you the Wikipedia highlights. Let's start at the very beginning. Picture this: a young boy named Kwame, born in the village of Nkroful. Now, this wasn't just any boy. This was a kid with big dreams. While other kids were busy climbing trees and chasing goats, Nkrumah was already thinking about how to free his people from colonial rule. No pressure, right? Fast forward a few years and he's in Achimota School, then off to London and Lincoln University in the United States. This man wasn't just collecting degrees. He was absorbing ideas, rubbing shoulders with revolutionaries, and crafting his vision for Africa. And boy, what a vision it was. So he gets invited back to the Gold Coast to be the General Secretary of the United Gold Coast Convention, the UGCC. Now, the UGCC was like a well-meaning group project that lacked a leader. Enter Nkrumah, he brings flags, offices, and organization. Suddenly, people know who they are. But here's where it gets juicy. Nkrumah decides, you know what? I can do this better myself. He breaks away and forms the Convention People's Party, the CPP. Cue dramatic music. In 1957, Ghana gains independence and Nkrumah becomes prime minister. And listen, the man didn't just stop there. Oh no. He wanted to lead not just Ghana but all of Africa into a new era. A union government for Africa, rapid industrialization, scientific socialism. He had plans so big they made Elon Musk look like he was playing it safe. But there's a thin line between vision and obsession. Nkrumah poured money into factories, state farms, and massive social projects. The result? Well, let's just say the tomato factory wasn't exactly crushing it. His plans were grand, but the execution? Not so much. Meanwhile, back at home, people were grumbling. The economy was tanking, the Preventive Detention Act was throwing critics in jail, and Nkrumah was surrounded by sycophants who made sure he never got the memo. After several assassination attempts, Nkrumah became increasingly paranoid. And then came the final blow, a coup in 1966 while he was on a trip to Hanoi. Just like that, his reign was over. Nkrumah spent his remaining years in Guinea, where he was still dreaming big but powerless to make it happen. Now, if you're wondering how I know all this, let me introduce you to this gem, Kwame Nkrumah, Vision and Tragedy by David Rooney. It's a book that doesn't just tell Nkrumah's story. It dives deep into his psyche, his policies, and yes, even his flaws. Rooney takes us through Nkrumah's life, from his childhood in Nkroful to his final days in exile. The book doesn't shy away from tough questions. Was Nkrumah's vision for Africa ahead of its time? Absolutely. Did his grand ambitions sometimes veer into psychotic obsession? Maybe. Rooney gives us a balanced view, mixing admiration for Nkrumah's achievements with honest critiques of his missteps. But let's be real, this isn't a light read. It's dense, detailed, and sometimes a little too reliant on sources from Ghana's military government, which raises some eyebrows. And Rooney's tone? Well, let's just say he doesn't give Nkrumah a lot of credit for his successes. And here's a fun fact I picked up from the book. You know the word awam? It's slang in Ghana for deception, but guess what? It's actually an acronym from Nkrumah's era, Association of West African Merchants. Who knew? In the end, Kwame Nkrumah, Vision and Tragedy is a fascinating read, but it's just one side of the story. If you really want to understand Nkrumah, you'll need to read other accounts too. Love him or hate him, there's no denying his impact, not just on Ghana, but on Africa as a whole. So whether you're a history buff, a political junkie, or just someone curious about one of Africa's most enigmatic leaders, this book is a great place to start. But remember, read it with an open mind and maybe a healthy dose of skepticism. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into Nkrumah's life. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more historical breakdowns. I'll leave a link for you to get your hands on this book in the description. And hey, if you've read the book, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, stay curious.